for my interest especially is looking at ED&I within traditionally male-dominated industries. This research that I'm sort of talking about today is really my first sort of foray into the foundation industries. All of my previous research has been looking in the professional services, so finance, banking, and law. And it's been interesting to see some of the similar issues, but then also the real unique issues as well within the foundation industries. So yeah, thank you again, Joe, for inviting me to come to speak to everyone. I'm really looking forward to getting your own thoughts on this research. The talk that I am giving and the findings, it's a bit, well, now let's say it was complicated for me to put my head around, because this is initially the project that we ran a year ago that has now finished. But now we're trying to return to the field a little bit more, because some of the ideas that we had around how equality, diversity, and inclusion can link in with sort of sustainability agendas, the data we had it was a little bit loose almost. We wanted to build upon that a lot more. So it's much more conceptual how we're building on this. And then hopefully moving forward, we can really get a more solid link there between ED&I and sustainability. So yeah, just a bit of background onto the project that we ran. It was funded by the Transforming Foundation Industries Network between April and October last year. Primarily, this was a case to do with just one single firm who were working in lots of different areas of the foundation industries and the wider built environment, but primarily within concrete. And we were working with them to look at how we could improve their equality, diversity, and inclusion strategies in a way that could potentially also support their sustainability as well. This was led by Professor Jennifer Tomlinson with co-investigators of Dr. Ulia Besa, myself, and Professor Vera Trapman as well. So I'll just jump into a little bit about sort of the background and the motivations of why we started doing this research. And I think, as perhaps we know, the foundation industries do face some stark challenges in achieving that transformation required to decarbonisation, which are only really emphasised by a persistent lack of workforce diversity. And again, as I think we may know, the workforce remains male-dominated, which for me was one of those areas where I thought, this is what I am most interested in researching, but also is ageing. Where we've seen, I think, in the past, a lot of recruitment still relies on word of mouth, meaning that there has been a struggle of recruiting both women and ethnic minority workers. In 2020, admittedly, these are not the most up-to-date stats. It was quite difficult for me to find these, going through a lot of the ONS data, where I think the foundation industry isn't fully defined within the ONS data, but we found that, yeah, women represent 16% of all workers, and ethnic minority workers only 7.1%. So yeah, due to this composition of the current workforce, we do potentially have the looming skill shortage that we are maybe being felt. Previously, we'd seen, and when we'd spoken to people, the sector had relied on migrant labour and recruiting people from overseas to fill those labour shortages. But obviously, COVID, Brexit really stripped the ability of the sector to continue doing that, which is then only emphasising the challenges that we're facing in recruiting women and ethnic minority workers. So then when we were looking at the challenges in achieving decarbonisation, start to realise that this lack of diversity is only sort of increasing those challenges, not only through the loss of existing skills as workers are moving towards retiring, but in the almost survival state that some of the sectors being in meeting future demand, rather than having the ability and the resources to start investing in innovation and technological advancements. So that's where we thought that diversity and inclusion, recruiting from more diverse work sources, could perhaps help with this. And again, for us, this is one thing that we've returned to post-research, a book chapter that we're working on now, is really then looking at not only ED&I within transition, but inequalities within climate change to really frame this. Climate inequalities are really now starting to be recognised as central to the drivers and consequences of climate change. We know that 10% of earners in the global north, climate change primarily driven by 10% of earners concentrated in the global north. And these emissions are most likely related to investments that are directly linked to the expansion of deforestation in Latin America and Southeast Asia, rather than patterns of consumption, which we've previously thought. It's directly their investments that's really driving this. And then when we actually start looking at the outcomes of climate changes, who's going to experience these the worst, it's predominantly low-income groups in the global south, where they're feeling already detrimental effects due to losses of income, higher food prices, and deteriorating health conditions. For a while, it has also seemed that we've been looking at this very much in a global south versus global north thing, whereas, say, climate change driven by rich earners within the global north being felt by low earners in the global south. But we're even starting to see within countries like in the UK, where low-income groups in the UK are much more likely to be negatively impacted by the consequences of climate change compared to higher earners due to air pollution, where lower earners are more likely to be living, but also risk of flooding, where lower earners don't have the resources or the funds to be able to help mitigate with that. So again, in the global south, as I say, this book chapter that we're writing, we tried to take a bit of a global north versus global south perspective on it. And we do see that in the global south, inequalities are increasingly recognised as critical, where again, women, low-income groups, and indigenous communities especially are much more vulnerable to displacement, loss of employment, and food scarcity. But feminist literature around climate change is really a bit skeptical about how we really frame that, of prescribing vulnerability to these groups and reducing them to victims almost strips them of their ability to actually instigate change and act as critical agents of change in response to climate change. And instead, when we allow these communities to be at the forefront of climate change mitigation and allow them to participate in strategy and decision making, they offer critical innovations, knowledge of local resources and economies. And we have lots of examples, which I'd be more than happy to discuss afterwards if people are interested in that. So when we started looking at ED&I and the foundation industries or the green economy as a whole, we started hitting, and this is where we were trying to get concepts and theorization of how this can link together, is that we started hitting a bit of a wall in which there's very little research then into how inequalities manifest themselves in the workplace in the foundation industries, but also in the green economy. And instead, they focus much more at the macro level of how are women and ethnic minority workers participating in political and economic strategy. And we're seeing that these are still very much led by white men, or how different groups are adapting, as the examples of works in the global south working fantastically in agriculture, but it's specifically within there. It doesn't look at what is happening within the workplace. But what we do know is that green jobs, and as we found through our research, work in the foundation industries can offer really highly paid, highly skilled work that does demand high levels of human capital, but offer really good careers. But when we look at current policies, and one of the examples that we do have in existing literature of green job creation, we see they do have a positive effect on employment, creating jobs, but the outcomes of these job creation is quite uneven, disadvantaging certain groups and reinforcing existing inequalities, especially when we consider the sector already being dominated by white men. The jobs that are created are often short-term and demand high levels of human capital. So firms, when they create these jobs, are much more likely to recruit someone already within that role, already within the foundation industries, rather than looking at someone from the local economy who might not already be in the sector. And when they do create jobs in which women and ethnic minority workers from the local area can move into, these are often quite precarious. They are low paid, short term, and low skilled as well, and thus doesn't offer the same sort of job quality as those ones which are being taken by those already within the sector. So without then investing into training and education throughout the entire career of the point of, initial education throughout the career, there's a real risk of almost ring fencing these jobs to people already within the sector and reducing opportunities for good employment within the green economy and the foundation industries as a whole to those who aren't already a part of it. So I think beyond arguments for justice within, inclusive transitions, which is always a big part of, for me, of starting from this, of looking at if we're going to create good quality green jobs, these need to be open to everyone. There is still a business case argument within there as well, that firms are massively missing out on the skills and knowledge required to support decarbonisation in failing to integrate a lens of ED&I. And a lot of this sort of comes from an initial skills-based argument that by recruiting from a more diverse talent pool, firms can collaborate and co-produce knowledge from workers who have greater insights into local resources and diverse economies. And this is where that initial research project existed, the one that we have completed at the end of last year, and which we really want to look at. So can we pursue, initially it was workforce sustainability of recognising the potential looming skill shortages, but eventually environmental sustainability. So can we pursue that through increasing and enhancing equality, diversity, and inclusion in a firm? And how can this then stimulate transformation towards sustainable futures in addressing skill shortages, but accessing those new skills and innovations from different sources of labour, primarily looking at women and ethnic minorities who are massively underrepresented in the foundation industry. When taken together, the idea of this project was to provide a case study that we could then use across the sector that would look at factors of attrition and allow us to develop the appropriate strategies to attract and retain gender and ethnic minorities, which again, I'll talk a little bit about our recommendations at the end of this. A little bit about the study focus and the methodology to give some of the sort of technical details before I go into the findings that we had. This was very much a case study. We worked with one single firm who did operate in lots of different areas of the built environment, but were primarily a concrete firm. Because of this, whenever I've sort of given these talks and sort of discussed about the findings, I'm always skeptical about giving the ones that were very, very specific to them, because one of our big recommendations for firms is to look internally at what is driving gender and ethnic inequalities within firms, rather than appropriating what other firms are doing in the sector. Each firm has their own unique issues that they need to understand and address. So the findings again today are focused very much on sustainability, keeping what was unique to them, but also because they did give us some very privileged data as well. We don't really want to be sharing that with everyone so they can hold that anonymity. So we did combine qualitative data analysis with quantitative analysis. We were looking at gender and ethnic pay gaps with the firm, but more specifically looking at how we could make recommendations on how this firm could be more inclusive. We had administrative data on 401 employees for 5 years up to 2022. This included pay, nominal bonuses, additional analysis and hours worked, and this allowed us to map out the gender and ethnic pay gap and understand what was driving this. We also got exit data on 253 employees, with a further 34 in-depth exit interviews analysed, which allowed us to look at them and try to understand again where we know that women and ethnic minorities workers were more likely to leave the firm than white men, what is driving that, and trying to understand some thematic analysis within there. And based on this, we did primary data collection with interviews that we called key informants, which were very much senior lead key stakeholders related both to equality, diversity, inclusion, and sustainability. And then we did some what we called sort of career development interviews with workers from across the firm, and then we could map out their almost like life history of these workers and see what is happening within their careers that might be causing these discrepancies that is stopping women and ethnic minority workers from progressing at the same rates as men. We did 35 of these, 24 were women, 11 were men. When it came to the sort of breakdown of the ethnic makeup of the employees, it was a bit difficult. I'd estimate about 50% of these came from an ethnic minority background, but not everyone confirmed or disclosed their ethnicity. So we could only put a sort of rough estimate that half of these workers were non-white. And then these were the 5 sort of key themes that came from all of our data collection and all of this research in the initial project. As I say, one of which was career development, where we were understanding a little bit of what was happening across the entire career span, not just in this firm, but in the foundation industries, that might be stopping ethnic minority workers from progressing at the same rates as men, and also perhaps leaving at earlier stages as men. We looked at equality, diversity, and inclusion in the firm, looking at what they were doing already, any specific difficulties and what participants thought they could be doing better. Similar with fair pay, looking at levels of the gender pay gap, what was driving that, what they could do better, and similar with the sustainability strategy. I will say with those first 3, I feel that if I spoke about them in a lot of depth, I could speak for hours on them of what we found, but I feel that I will almost preaching to the choir already. I know that everyone will most likely understand a lot of these issues. So instead, and from speaking with Joe, I wanted to just focus on the link in sustainability with ED&I within that presentation, because that's where we're really moving forward with this research now, is conceptually trying to link the 2 of these. And that for me as well, first, we thought this could be most interesting for everyone, but me in a more selfish way, I think it'd be really good to sort of get everyone's ideas and feedback on how we're moving forward with this research and how we're thinking that this could all link together. I will say though, I'll just jump back there. If anyone does want me to talk about those other things, anyone has any questions about those themes, do please ask me. I'm more than happy to discuss them in the Q&A afterwards. So looking at then the linking equality, diversity, and inclusion with sustainability, there were 3 key factors that we found from our data. And I will say, one of the reasons that we're trying to build on this now, and you might see afterwards, is that the data that we got it all came from interview data, and it was quite difficult to get this data. I think a lot of people hadn't really thought about this, and it was something that we were maybe just developing for the first time and trying to figure out and get this data for. So we're moving forward in the future to try and get a more empirical solid link between this to really try and develop further how diversity can influence sustainability. And as I say, when we did initially do these interviews, we kept hitting a barrier when we were asking participants. We'd say, talk about ED&I and sustainability separately, and then ask how they were linked. And they would often state that at a policy level, they are bundled together. They're overseen by the same person. So, of course, they are linked. But when we started diving further into that, as to how they were actually linked and how they can maybe support one another, it was really difficult. And I kept finding that participants I interviewed were just as interested in my thoughts in this as we were trying to actually answer this question, which a lot of times didn't really help us because they thought it was, but it wasn't something they thought about, and it wasn't something that was being done more than being bundled together at a strategy level. But eventually, we started getting to some people where we could flesh this out a little bit, where it was seen that diversity was almost the enabler to sustainability, that you can't achieve sustainability without a diverse workforce or an inclusive culture. And this primarily, and initially within this project, was really reliant on skills and skills-based arguments, in that by ensuring you've got a diverse workforce, it then allows a firm to pull on a wider pool of resources, skills, and knowledge that naturally comes from recruiting from different sources. And having that can allow you to overcome the challenges that the foundation industries are really facing as a sector in transition into decarbonisation, to trying to achieve net zero, etc., etc. And a lot of this, again, there's two quotes here that it was almost emphasising a blend of skills of existing workers and recruiting new workers. It was recognising that a lot of the older workers moving towards retirement have got critical skills that can be lost if they're allowed to retire, so that firms need to do something to ensure that these workers are retained and you retain their knowledge, whilst also bringing in a much more diverse workforce at the bottom, where you can have new ways of thinking that can complement each other. And this is something that we're starting to see a lot more in academia as well, looking at the best ways of doing ED&I. It's retaining older workers who have a lot of skills and then complementing that with younger workers from a diverse talent pool, and making sure and really putting in the effort that they can work well together and having that real diverse pool of talent, not talent, but of knowledge, skills, and resources that a firm can pull on. And just one of these quotes of the idea is that if you bring more people in, you get those different ideas. If you're open to everyone, you bring new ideas from everywhere, new approaches, new ideas, and new innovative things. And as long as you make sure you give the opportunity for everyone, that should support sustainability. But again, I think that might emphasize that difficulty we had, that people thought we need to bring in these diverse workers, but it might improve sustainability. We want to flesh that out a little bit more now. And one way in which we started doing this, of building on it from a solely skills base, was to instead see how potentially these are interlinked at a policy level beyond that of them just falling under the same strategy. In the each of these different strands of ED&I and sustainability does have the potential to influence the outcome of the other. And I'll give one of the examples that we saw from either side, and it might sound like I'm having a bit of a divergence here talking about something else, but I promise it does make sense, in which one of the recommendations we made for the firm that we worked with to improve their ED&I practice was to look at flexible working, not solely in terms of hours, but in the place of work in which people were doing it, looking if there was ways of doing remote working. And we knew that there was potential difficulties in doing this in a sector, especially concrete, that does require manual labour and on-site presence. But a lack of flexibility was a huge factor when it came to looking at exit data and our interviews around career development. People who had any need for flexible working, be it childcare, be it care and duties, or even disabilities that restricted travel, they couldn't progress past a certain stage in their career, and they'd started looking at employment in different sectors to facilitate this. So people who'd been trained and worked in the foundation industries all their careers were now looking at leaving to find more accommodating working conditions because they couldn't find that in the foundation industries. And these were often really highly skilled senior workers that the sector's then losing out on because they don't have that flexibility. So implementing that flexibility not only keeps these workers in the sector, but also potentially reduces barriers of entry into the sector. But we also know from a lot of environmental scientists that flexible working can have quite a strong effect on a firm's carbon emissions, especially with remote working. So reducing the actual emissions at a site and also reducing commuting related emissions can have a positive effect on sustainability strategies. So immediately, like, this is one in which it will have a huge effect on ED&I if we can strengthen flexible working throughout the sector, but also can have an almost unintended outcome in terms of sustainability. And then on the flip side, looking at the sustainability policies, when we were asking participants, how can the firm improve sustainability? One that kept coming up to us was around digital technologies and other innovations such as prefabrication. We're already seeing a lot of these investments into the sector and how these can support sustainability. And that's one thing that I've loved of doing this research and becoming more involved in the foundation industries, is seeing these new innovations that, admittedly, myself as a social scientist who's been terrible at the hard sciences, etc., seeing how these fantastic innovations are coming through with the intention of improving an output. But one area that was perhaps underdeveloped and people hadn't quite thought of is how these new technologies can really support underrepresented demographics into moving into the sector. One example we had from the data was around digital technologies and potentially removing the need for someone to be on site conducting heavy manual labor. You open up employment opportunities to people who might be able to, who may have been unable to take these due to disabilities, for example. And we had this with one of our workers who had recently become disabled and he was potentially going to have to leave the sector again because he couldn't continue his job. But it was seen in different countries and different sectors how digital technologies were allowing people like him to continue in the role. So again, these sort of technologies that are aimed at sustainability potentially can also keep people within the sector and reduce those barriers of entry for people who aren't represented well within there. But underlying all of these, and this was one thing that we've sort of come away from now and we're looking at building a little bit further, is that there's a real need for an inclusive culture to actually realise any benefits that you may bring through diverse workers. You can have these policies and you can bring in diverse workers, but without moving beyond that diversity and equality into looking at inclusion, you're missing out on a lot of the entire benefits of equality, diversity, and inclusion. And a lot of the sort of theoretical background that we're doing with this is around cognitive diversity and the idea that when you do recruit people from diverse sources, they have their own lived experiences that is different from the, again, let's use the obviously the foundation industry as the example. When you recruit women and ethnic minority workers, they have their own lived experiences that shapes their knowledge and ideas and their ways of thinking that differs from the norm within the sector. By bringing these in and making sure that they actually feel a level of psychological safety, you have these skills where people are empowered to challenge norms and contribute to innovations. But as I say, you need that inclusivity. Without that, of ensuring that people have that psychological safety, they may not bring those ideas to the forefront and aren't empowered to challenge norms. And we had two fantastic examples as we were doing this research on this, where the firm we'd worked with had done fantastic work in recruiting from real diverse sources. They had a lot of women's representation within the workforce. Ethnic minority workers were very well represented, and a lot of disabled workers as well, which we thought was fantastic to see. But one of the big issues that they had is that they recruited people from overseas and then sort of put them into the workplace without really then supporting them afterwards. So they'd really ticked off the diversity part, but these workers didn't really feel included within the workspace. And the two that I always come to mind, one had come from South America, one had moved from the Middle East, and they were quite shocked at a lot of the sustainability practices that we had here in the UK, where from their domestic market, it was mainly around waste, that water waste and material wastage, it didn't really exist in the sense that they had none, because they needed to reuse and they needed to recycle all their materials, whereas they were a bit shocked that here in the UK we had acceptable levels that, as I say, they found quite shocking how high they were, whereas in their domestic markets they already had technologies and ways of working that almost eliminated all of this. But the big issue was that the firm was bringing these people who had this knowledge and could bring these ideas. They never once said that they felt empowered enough to actually challenge that. And they never felt empowered to actually bring forward and say, this is one area that we can improve on. Even though they would say to us doing those interviews, these are areas they can, they didn't think that they could act, that they'd be listened to and they could act on that. So without that inclusivity, you're almost missing the entire point of diversity and inclusion, especially when we are thinking about sustainability. I think this is just one final quote that perhaps does exemplify it better than I can. I'm aware that sometimes when I speak, it always comes a little gibberish and I struggle to get my thoughts out. But one of our participants was looking at this entirely from an innovations perspective, saying that environmental sustainability and that transition to decarbonisation can't happen without ED&I, that it's almost impossible if you haven't got different people with different backgrounds, different ideas and different ways of thinking. And that if we do that, we'll have more women designing the world to make sure that it's not a design that's just designed by men and for men. And that they're then designing the future in a way where we all have a voice and it's better for everyone. So, as I say, that was all the sort of findings that we had from the previous research. And now we're trying to plot this all together and figure out conceptually, okay, so how can ED&I fully support sustainability strategies? We're going to be returning and trying to get some more data on this, especially at the policy level. But I think this is really where my mind is thinking conceptually how this all fits together. I think as a baseline, firms need to look at a policy level, looking at understanding how ED&I and sustainability can support one another in their goals. So looking at flexible working, investment into digital technologies and offsite working. That can then allow and help perhaps support in recruiting from underrepresented demographics that initially mitigates any potential skill shortages and brings in the skills needed to ensure the actual sustainability of the sector. But then looking at retaining diverse workers throughout the entire career span, having greater representation in senior leadership roles allows a firm to pull upon a much wider pool of resources, skills, and innovation to have much more creative thinking, creative decision-making, and innovations to address some of the challenges faced in decarbonisation. But as I say, none of this can really be achieved if there isn't a truly inclusive culture that provides the psychological safety that allows workers to be empowered and feel empowered to challenge the norms and contribute towards the strategic decision making. Just final one, I thought it'd be worth just outlining a little bit of our research moving forward. As I say, this is very much our previous research, and then some of the ideas that we're coming up, which are much more conceptual in a forthcoming book chapter. We do have a survey that we're looking at getting released soon. We've had a couple of delays. We wanted to get it all done by now, but we had a few delays on there, where we're sending out to everyone we can in foundation industries, really, in human resource, sustainability and innovation roles, where we want to get ideas and understand a little bit about what is already happening within the sector in terms of ED&I and sustainability. Are firms already linking these, and how do these people in these decision-making functions see that these potentially are linked? This is then helping with the forthcoming book chapter that we have, which, as I say, this is the more conceptual side where we're looking at how gender and intersectional inequalities exist within the transition to a green economy. And they're also when we're looking at within, I think it's going to be next year, returning to our initial case study firm, and we're going to be measuring the impacts of the recommended ED&I interventions that we actually recommended to them, with the idea that we were very aware that, and this is common, I think, across all of the economy, we're not 100% sure what works best in terms of ED&I within each specific sector. So hopefully we can return to this and look and say, okay, these are my interventions that work, these are what not. So hopefully we should have that done by the end of next year as well. But as I say, that is everything for me. I hope it's been interesting. I hope it's been useful. And I'd be more than happy to take any questions.